Right now, two stories that most coverage is treating separately are actually converging into one, and the timing is not a coincidence. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has renewed its stated intent to kill an American president, and the United States military is actively rehearsing what a ground operation against Iranian territory would actually look like. Both of these things are happening this week, during the same funeral period, and they are connected in ways worth walking through carefully. Start with the assassination threat, because it did not appear out of nowhere. Iran's campaign against Donald Trump's life has a documented history stretching back years, and understanding that history is the only way to properly weigh how seriously to take what's being reported now. In 2024, federal prosecutors charged an Iranian operative named Asif Merchant with working on behalf of the IRGC to arrange political assassinations on American soil, including a plot targeting Trump. Merchant, according to Justice Department filings and his own trial testimony, had been trained in IRGC tradecraft, traveled to the United States specifically to recruit people who could carry out the operation, and ultimately met with undercover law enforcement officers he believed were hired killers, paying them a cash advance before his arrest. He was convicted earlier this year of murder for hire and attempting an act of terrorism, and now faces up to life in prison. Separately, an Afghan national named Farhad Shakeri was charged in connection with a related IRGC-directed scheme that prosecutors say also involved efforts to target Trump alongside other planned operations against dissidents living in the United States. Both cases were publicly framed by American officials as part of a broader Iranian retaliation campaign tied to the 2020 killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force commander whose death Tehran has treated as an open wound demanding an answer. That history did not end with convictions. Earlier this year, the U.S. Secretary of War announced that American forces had located and killed the IRGC commander, identified as the architect of the plot against Trump, a strike that Trump himself confirmed publicly, telling reporters plainly that the man had tried twice and that American forces had gotten to him first. That single sentence tells you how this administration has chosen to treat these threats going forward, not as background noise to be managed quietly, but as justification for direct lethal action against the individuals believed responsible. Now, this week, new reporting has surfaced describing what's being called the Mukhtar Unit, an IRGC-linked structure reportedly working to coordinate with criminal networks, including Mexican cartel contacts and elements of the Iranian diaspora abroad, toward renewed efforts against Trump and other American officials. It's important to be precise about where this specific claim currently stands. It has circulated through open-source intelligence aggregators and a handful of outlets citing what they describe as leaked reporting, but it has not yet been independently confirmed by major wire services or officially acknowledged in the kind of detailed public charging documents that accompanied the Merchant and Shakeri cases. That doesn't mean it's false. Given Iran's demonstrated prosecuted history of running exactly this kind of operation against the same target, the claim is entirely consistent with an established pattern rather than an implausible one. But it's a meaningfully different category of claim than a federal indictment, and it deserves to be treated with that distinction in mind rather than repeated as settled fact. What is not in dispute is the rhetoric coming out of Tehran during this exact window. Senior Iranian officials, speaking publicly during the ongoing funeral proceedings for the late Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, have stated that those responsible for his killing, language widely understood to include Trump directly, will not be permitted what they described as a natural death. Iran's military leadership has separately reaffirmed its position that an existential conflict exists between Iran and Israel, framing the war in terms that leave no room for a negotiated coexistence and asserting that Iran intends to avenge its losses. This is not new rhetoric in tone, but the frequency and directness of it during a funeral period, watched by international media and broadcast into every faction of Iranian politics simultaneously, gives it a different weight than similar statements made in ordinary circumstances. Now turn to the American side of this, because the military posture in the region has been building for months and has accelerated notably in just the past several days. The United States currently has one of the largest concentrations of air and naval power assembled in the Middle East since the Iraq War, a buildup that began with the deployment of multiple carrier strike groups back in February and has continued essentially without pause since. Two amphibious ready groups built around the USS Tripoli and the USS Boxer, together carrying thousands of Marines from the 11th and 31st Marine Expeditionary Units, have been operating in the region for months alongside additional airborne infantry moved in from the 82nd Airborne Division. Independent military analysts tracking open-source deployment data have reported that in just the past several days, additional A-10 close air support aircraft arrived at a Jordanian airbase within strike range of western Iran, and that total American ground force presence in the Gulf now sits in the range of 10,000 personnel, a figure that has prompted some of those same analysts to say plainly that something is being prepared, even while expressing skepticism that a full-scale ground incursion into Iranian home territory is actually imminent. The specific scenario that has drawn the most serious attention from defense analysts is not an invasion of the Iranian mainland, but a potential seizure of Karg Island, the terminal responsible for the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports, sitting roughly 15 miles off the Iranian coast. A former CENTCOM commander has publicly estimated that as few as 1,500 Marines would be sufficient to secure the island itself, and Trump has publicly threatened to destroy its oil infrastructure outright if Iran continues restricting traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts have also been candid about the risks of such an operation. Forces holding an island that close to the Iranian coast would remain vulnerable to counterattack, and a cutoff of Iran's oil exports would simultaneously deplete global supply and drive prices higher worldwide, a cost that would land on consumers far beyond the region. This is the kind of operation the current force posture would meaningfully support, and it is very likely one of the scenarios being actively rehearsed in the exercises now underway, even though officials have not confirmed that any final decision to execute it has been made. Put these two threads together, and the picture becomes clearer than either one is on its own. Iran's leadership, in the middle of burying the man Israeli and American strikes killed at the very start of this war, is publicly reaffirming its intent to kill the sitting American president who authorized and continued that campaign. The United States, in the same window, is visibly expanding its ground and air combat capability in the region to a level that specifically supports scenarios well beyond simple deterrence, including a potential physical seizure of Iranian economic infrastructure. Neither side appears to be treating the current pause in open hostilities as anything more than exactly that, a pause taken so that Iran could conduct funeral proceedings and the United States could observe its own Independence Day weekend. Before both sides return to the underlying confrontation, neither has actually resolved. There is also a domestic political dimension to Iran's posture worth understanding, because it helps explain why the regime continues escalating its rhetoric, even while facing overwhelming conventional military disadvantage. Iran's economy has been devastated by sanctions, currency collapse, and the direct costs of this war, conditions that have already produced lethal crackdowns on domestic protest driven by inflation and economic desperation. A government under this level of internal strain often calculates that appearing weak internationally poses a greater threat to its own survival than continued confrontation does. Publicly reaffirming an intent to kill the American president, regardless of the practical feasibility of actually carrying it out, serves a domestic purpose almost independent of military strategy. It signals to an exhausted, economically battered population that the regime remains defiant rather than defeated. That dynamic makes any form of visible de-escalation politically costly for Iran's leadership, which in turn makes continued provocative rhetoric, even rhetoric with limited operational backing, more likely rather than less. There is also considerable confusion inside Iran's own governing structure right now, which adds real uncertainty to how seriously to weigh any single official statement as representing a coordinated national position. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not appeared publicly since taking the position in early March, and has notably not appeared at his own father's funeral, despite reporting suggesting he had sought permission to attend before his own security apparatus reportedly overruled him. Multiple credible outlets have reported, citing officials with direct knowledge, that he is still recovering from serious injuries sustained in the same strike that killed his father, injuries that have included reported surgeries and ongoing physical therapy. In the middle of this funeral period, Iran's government also briefly removed and then, within a matter of hours, reinstated the head of its judiciary, a figure closely associated with the country's execution and detention apparatus, an episode that by itself illustrates just how much internal instability and factional disagreement currently exists at the top of the Iranian state. When a government is this internally fractured, public statements from any single official, however forceful, don't necessarily reflect a unified, coordinated national decision, which is part of why intelligence services on the American and Israeli side treat these declarations as worth monitoring closely without automatically assuming central command and control sits behind every one of them. Meanwhile, the broader regional picture continues to shift in ways that materially affect Iran's remaining options. Hamas has been effectively dismantled as a fighting force in Gaza. Hezbollah in Lebanon is undergoing a slow, contentious disarmament process that regional analysts warn carries real risk of triggering internal Lebanese conflict before it's complete. The former Syrian government collapsed entirely, removing Iran's most important land corridor for supplying its remaining regional proxies. What remains of Iran's proxy network is now largely confined to portions of Iraq and Yemen, and the Iraqi government has set its own deadline for Iran-aligned militias to disarm or face domestic military action. Each of these developments strips away another piece of the leverage Iran has historically relied on to deter direct confrontation with the United States and Israel, which is part of why some analysts argue that a direct campaign against Iran's remaining leadership and infrastructure inside its own borders was always going to be the final stage of this broader regional confrontation, rather than the opening one. There is also a global economic dimension to the buildup around Kharg Island specifically that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Kharg Island is not a minor facility. It is the single point through which the overwhelming majority of Iran's crude oil exports flow to international markets, making it one of the most consequential pieces of energy infrastructure anywhere in the Middle East. Any American operation against it, whether a blockade, a strike, or an actual seizure, would not just affect Iran's government revenue. It would remove a meaningful share of global crude supply from the market almost overnight, at a moment when oil prices have already been volatile for months because of disruptions to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts who have studied this scenario have been candid that such an operation carries real risk of backfiring on the very governments considering it, since a sudden supply shock could drive prices up sharply worldwide, creating exactly the kind of inflationary pressure that Western governments have been trying to avoid throughout this entire conflict. That tension between the military logic of targeting Iran's most valuable economic asset and the economic risk of actually doing so is very likely part of why officials have continued rehearsing the scenario without yet committing to executing it. Human rights monitors and religious freedom organizations have documented an intensifying campaign against Iran's Christian minority in recent months, including the closure and seizure of historic church properties in Tehran, arrests of converts, and continued use of the death penalty and lengthy imprisonment for religious activity the state considers a threat. This crackdown has continued largely without significant public statements from major international religious or political leaders, a gap that human rights advocates have specifically criticized given the scale and documented severity of what's being reported. So where does all of this actually leave the situation heading into the days immediately ahead? The ceasefire framework signed in mid-June technically remains in effect, and both governments have used this week's dual commemorations, Iran's funeral and America's Independence Day weekend, as a mutually convenient pause rather than a genuine step toward resolution. But neither side has withdrawn its underlying position. Iran's leadership, fractured and economically desperate as it is, continues to publicly affirm its intent toward the sitting American president. The United States continues to expand a force posture in the region that goes well beyond what pure deterrence would require, into territory that specifically supports scenarios involving direct seizure of Iranian infrastructure. And an unconfirmed but plausible report of renewed cartel-linked assassination planning sits in the background of all of it, consistent with a documented pattern of exactly this kind of operation that Iran has already attempted and already lost people over in the recent past. There is also an intelligence dimension to this standoff that rarely gets discussed openly, but shapes how confident American and Israeli officials can be in tracking Iran's internal decision-making. Iran's government has been penetrated by outside intelligence services to a degree that has become increasingly difficult for Tehran to conceal. Multiple senior officials eliminated over the course of this war were reportedly located through a combination of signals intelligence, satellite tracking, and human sources operating inside Iran's own security and military apparatus. That penetration matters directly to how seriously to weigh a report like the Mukhtar claim. If Iran's internal communications and personnel movements are being monitored as closely as recent strikes suggest, then any coordinated planning involving cartel contacts or diaspora networks abroad would face a genuine risk of detection well before execution, a dynamic that has already played out with the earlier plots against Trump that ended in arrests, and eventually, a targeted strike against the commander believed responsible. This doesn't mean a future attempt couldn't succeed. It does mean that Iran's own track record of running these operations against heavily monitored American targets has, so far, ended in failure every time it has been publicly documented. And there is no clear indication that the underlying conditions making that monitoring possible have changed. The funeral itself adds another layer of operational complexity worth understanding. Iranian authorities have expected several million people to move through Tehran, Qom, and other cities over the course of the mourning period, with foreign delegations from more than 100 countries also present. Gatherings of that scale are inherently difficult to secure, and Iran's own Revolutionary Guard has issued public warnings against any attempt to target the proceedings, language that itself reflects genuine concern inside Iran's security establishment about vulnerability during this specific window. Whether that concern is about external strikes, internal unrest, or both is not entirely clear from the outside, but the scale of the security posture surrounding the funeral tells you that Iran's own leadership does not consider this a moment of confident strength, regardless of the defiant rhetoric being delivered from its podiums. Watch three things closely in the days ahead. Watch whether any additional detail on the Mukhtar reporting is independently corroborated by major outlets or confirmed through an actual law enforcement action, the way the Merchant and Shakari cases eventually were. Watch whether the current American force buildup in the Gulf continues accelerating once the funeral period concludes on July 9th, or whether it levels off as a purely defensive posture. And watch whether Iran's internal factional chaos, reflected in everything from the judiciary reshuffle to the new supreme leader's continued public absence, produces a more unified, centrally controlled response to American pressure, or whether it continues producing the kind of scattered, sometimes contradictory public statements that have characterized Iran's government since the war's opening strikes in February. The history here is not ambiguous. Iran has already run assassination operations against this president and lost operatives, a handler, and eventually the commander, believed to have ordered the campaign as a direct result. Whether it is prepared to run that same play again, with the same outcome, is the question the coming weeks are likely to answer.